welcome today. Welcome to our ALPOA-sponsored Firewise program. And I would like to introduce Scott Miller, who is on our Alto Lakes Golf and Country Club Board of Directors. He is also heading up the Firewise Committee. And Scott, you want to come up and introduce our speaker for us today?
Thank you, Deidre. So when I got on the board, I'm going to give you a real quick rundown here, but the big motivating factor for me to do that was to do what we're doing right now. And as you guys all know that have homes here, especially year-round residents, that we've dodged a lot of bullets in the past years when we could have had really much more devastating things happen than we've had happen. And so thankfully this board's on board with trying to pursue doing that, and I think with the help of the Forest Service, and Mary's going to fill you in about all that here shortly, and some their co-op money, and then individuals just, you know, I've already spent a whole bunch of money on my house thinning trees, and I don't want to wait. I think if you have the financial capability to do it, everybody ought to do it and stay on it, and it protects all of our investments. But anyway, Mary's going to show us all how to get that Firewise designation, which actually is something that would have to happen, you know, from lot line to lot line around the subdivision for us to get that. But that is the ultimate goal. So hopefully with her help we can get there. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to take this over here. Because I like to move. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Levin from New Mexico Forestry Division. So we are separate from the Forest Service, which is a national organization that represents like the Lincoln National Forest that actually manages public lands. So for New Mexico Forestry Division, we help individual landowners, communities, other state organizations, and federal organizations, and tribes. And so we act somewhat like a consultant, so it's a little bit different. But part of what I do is I connect grant funding that is available with those who would like to do some cost share thinning. So if that will be a small part of this, but just to tell you, I have a business card up here. So if anyone is interested in finding out about cost share thinning, you know, you can grab a business card and then just contact me. So I've got a lot of information. I'm going to go through this really quickly, but if you have any questions, please just shout them out. So I'm a teacher by nature, and so I love to share information with folks. So this is going to be Firewise 101 and Fire Behavior 101. So I hope you learned something, and again, we'll kind of move along. So, and thank you to Eric for all of this. Okay, so here's me, Mary Levin. My background is natural resource management. I'm a graduate of Northern Arizona University, go Lumberjacks. And graduated several years ago, actually worked on the Lincoln National Forest on the Sacramento District, doing timber, recreation lands, special uses, just about everything. I was an intern, so they put me everywhere, including in a fire tower and on the fire line. So have a lot of experience, boots on the ground, as we say. Okay, so a little bit about Firewise. Firewise is a national community program to help communities such as Alto Country Club, and Ranches of Sonterra, which is your northern neighbor, and Ruidoso, which is your southern neighbor. Both of those are already Firewise communities. So the idea is for education and to help people understand why you need to clean up your property and around your home so that you can be less at risk for wildfires when they happen. It's not if they happen, it's when they happen. So how many of y'all have lived here for more than 5 years? Okay, anybody more than 10 years? 15? 20? Anybody more than 20? We'll just leave it at that. So you all have seen Little Bear Fire, you've seen Three Rivers Fire, Cocopelli Fire, 248 Fire, and that's just in Lincoln County. There have also been several large fires over in Otero County. So the reality is that fire is here to stay. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. I know you can read this, but I don't have a script. So wildfires can put dozens, hundreds, even thousands of homes and people at risk. So the Firewise program is to take preventative action ahead of time. So it's very proactive. Okay, so everybody's heard the term WUI, W-U-I, which means Wildland Urban Interface. Very simply, it's not just for fires, it's for any sort of boundary area where you have a developed area that meets a wild area. So this specifically, when we refer to WUI, is talking about hazardous fuels mitigations, but it also can be wildlife. How many of you have had elk in your yard, deer in your yard, bear, mountain lions, you name it? So that's also considered wildland urban interface, where wildlands meet development. Okay, so this is my favorite part, understanding wildfire. Wildfire is a natural component in a forest ecology, so it's something that belongs there. But there's some history that I'd like to share that might be new to some of you. So what fire does is it actually recycles and returns nutrients to the soil, thins out area. If you get too many seedlings, then I always tell people it's kind of like if you had 11 brothers at the dinner table and one bowl of mashed potatoes, somebody's going to go hungry, right? So trees are the same way, vegetation is the same way. So if there's too much overcrowding, then all of them suffer, all of them struggle, and oftentimes they're much more susceptible to fire. Okay, so there are good fires, okay fires, and bad fires, and typically a large-scale fire will have components of all of these. So a good fire, again, recycles the nutrients back into nature and helps clean up the forest. So when we walk around, and especially with ponderosa pine, you see all the needles on the ground. That's called litter. That's natural forest litter. It's also called duff, so I'll use those terms interchangeably. So it consumes those and then recycles the nutrients back into the soil. Okay, so anybody remember the Moon Mountain Fire of 2016? With permission of the gentleman who took this photograph and submitted it, I believe, to the newspaper. So if you see the lights at the bottom, the little stripy lights, that's actually the high school. And so this fire went through an area that had thinning not too long before, and all of the slash had been cleaned up. So the fire, although it looks really big and scary, completely stayed on the ground, really didn't even scorch trees from what I understand. And this is that same area a week later. So most of the trees are green and healthy, and you cannot even tell that a fire's gone through. Now, if you were to walk up into the stand, you would see the ground is black. But for the most part, this is what a healthy fire is supposed to do: consume the material on the ground and not get up into the crowns of the trees. Okay? But society's influence has altered fire behavior, and it's not just we want to scold our ancestors who were pioneers, who came in and changed the landscape. There's a reason for that, and I'd like to be able to share that with you. So in 1910, just after we had railroads out here, we had pioneers out west. It was a very, very dry year. And so I'll just read this to you because I think this is right off one of the Forest Service websites as to why how the fire prevention program got started and why we put out all of the fires. So in the summer of 1910, a devastating series of forest fires swept over Idaho, Montana, and Washington state, culminating on August 20th through 21st in what's known as the Big Blow Up, coming only 5 years after the Forest Service was actually created. This seminal event made a deep and lasting impact on the agency and those that worked there. 3 future Forest Service chiefs were directly involved, meaning they were boots on the ground people with a shovel and a hoe trying to put the fire out, as were several other men who would eventually exert influence over the agency's fire protection policy following this fire. It pushed forest fire issues into public discourse and led into new fire prevention and suppression policies that still influence fire management today. So a few facts. The aftermath of the Big Blow Up, also if you Google it, it'll show up as the Great Fire of 1910, killed 86 people, most of them frontline firefighters, burned over 3 million acres of forested land and destroyed several towns in its path. So because of that huge event, and there was no way to stop it, if you've ever seen a large fire, there are some things you can do sometimes to slow it down, but it's very, very difficult to get a handle on it if we haven't done preventative work. So fearing the worst after the Great Fire of 1910, federal, state, and local agencies made wildfire suppression a priority because it was really big and really, really scary. So for over 100 years since that point, fire, once a natural part of forest ecology, was excluded pretty much 100% from the landscape. So what happens is those fuels all build up. So although it's very well intentioned and well understood, that policy created extra heavy fuel loads that now we're dealing with when we see these, they actually invented a term, it's called a mega fire, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, Yellowstone being one of them. Okay? Now when lightning strikes a dead tree, an abandoned campfire gets away, or another source of ignition starts a wildfire, the potential for a catastrophic event is much more likely, much more costly, and much more dangerous. So the Dixie Fire in California this past summer, just to give you an example, the ignition source was determined to be a fallen tree on a power line. So although it was man-caused, it wasn't kids playing with fireworks or matches out in the forest. It was simply a dead tree or a heavy branch fell on a power line, and it was so dry that it started a fire, and then it just raged out of control. So it burned from July 13th, and when I looked this up, it had just been out for 3 weeks. Isn't that amazing? That's a long time for a fire to burn. 1,300 structures were destroyed, 1 million plus acres were burned, an estimated cost of $1.15 billion. That's a lot. Okay, as previously mentioned, fires always played an important role in forest ecology. Recent studies have shown the following facts for forested land. Excuse me. Pre-1900. So pinyon juniper, we're sort of in a transition area here. So we're ponderosa pine, the low end of ponderosa pine, the high end of pinyon juniper. So if you were to draw a chart, it would go desert, grassland, chaparral, transition, pinyon juniper, ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, spruce fir, all the way up to subalpine, and then no trees, okay? So just to give you an idea. So typically, fires would occur before Western settlement every 3 to 5 years in pinyon juniper country, and every 3 to 7 years in pinyon juniper, 3 to 5 years in ponderosa pine, and mixed conifer was every 6 to 9 years. And I just pulled this off our agency's website last week, so this is very recent data. Across the board, stand replacement fires, which are high-intensity fires that instead of just staying on the ground and consuming the duff and the litter, they actually get up into the crowns of trees and burn hundreds, even thousands of acres completely. Usually there are a few patches in there for reseeding, but some of the fires are devastating enough there's no overstory left. So that's called a stand replacement fire. So the high-intensity fires that kill almost all of the trees occur between 1 and 3 years following an above-average wet period, like our summer we just had, and are followed by drought, which is what we're experiencing now. Okay, so I was part of a training group, an interagency training group that had a meeting on state lands, tribal lands, and national forest lands. And we drove around looking at different sites, and one of the gentlemen who is what's called a silviculturist, who specializes in how to create a healthy forest from an unhealthy forest, brought this sample from Northern Arizona University that was, it's a core center of a tree that was harvested off of Mescalero Indian Reservation, that the tree's first ring that it shows up was dated from 1760, and then the tree was harvested in 1995. So you can see each of the little call-outs is when there was a fire scar on the tree. The tree survived it. So a low-intensity fire that did not kill the tree came through on an average probably every 8 to 10 years until that big white area on the end when you see all the fires were suppressed. Isn't that interesting? So again, this is just right out our back door in Mescalero. Okay, so fire succession, like I said, I love to teach and help people understand. So when you have a stand replacement fire, in other words, all of the overstory and all of the understory is removed, it takes a long time for that forest to return to what's called a climax community. So all of the seed trees are gone, grasses and annuals will first come in, and then you'll have perennials and shrubs that will come in after that, then small trees, and then eventually the trees will come back to the stand type that it was before the fire. But in the Southwest, this often takes 200 years for stand replacement. It's a long time because we don't have a lot of water. But this was just some early stages of succession where you can see the stump, and then just exactly a year later, you see that annual grasses have already come in, and then some aspen saplings are coming in as well. And I just like this one because it kind of looks like hope, right? Out of the ashes, you have a little Douglas fir seedling. Okay, so again, it takes in the Southwest because we have very limited moisture, about 200 years for stand replacement to return to a climax community. So how do we move forward from here? There's a lot of bad news, a lot of heavy things to be thinking about. How do we get our forested lands back to a better place of health and restoration? Education and understanding and action, which is why you are all here today. Thank you very much. I know you had a lot of other choices of things that you could do, and you decided you wanted to spend some time learning about Firewise and about fire prevention, so we very much appreciate that. So again, back to some basics. The fire triangle. Sometimes I'll set up an exhibit like a three-legged stool. So the way that you put out a fire, and most all of you know this, is you have three legs or three sides of the fire triangle: oxygen, heat, and fuel. And then of course you have the ignition source. And the way you put out a fire is you remove one of the legs, one or more of the legs of a fire, and then it goes out. So if I have a fire and I put a blanket over it, what did I just remove? Oxygen. You can shout it out, it's okay. So if I have a fire and I put water on it, what two things did I remove? Oxygen and heat, right? So I cooled it down as well, okay? So very good. Okay, so this is the fire behavior triangle, which is a really interesting component. This is what a lot of those in fire science study to try to anticipate how to minimize the effects of a wildfire. And that's where Firewise came from, the scientific data from studies that get their information from the three basic parts of fire behavior. So weather, topography, and fuel. So whether we know temperature, moisture, humidity, precipitation. Topography would be like the aspect of the slope, the percent of slope, the rockiness, the terrain of the slope, and then fuel. So here's a big question. What is the only part of the fire behavior triangle that you or I have any control over at all? Fuel. So that's what thinning is, that's what Firewise is, and that you have direct control over fire behavior on your property and in your neighborhood and in your community. Okay, so fuel amount and fuel arrangement. Okay, so there's three different types of fire. One is a surface fire, that's one of the good kinds. And again, it just burns off the duff or the litter on the surface, returns the nutrients back to the soil. It's very healthy for the fire, it's like the Moon Mountain fire, okay? Then you have a ground fire, which is sort of a medium intensity fire, which burns off the surface fuels, but then also can go down below the surface into the soil itself. An example is, everybody's seen a dead stump, that's been cut long time ago. Well, that stump still has woody material, woody biomass that goes down below the surface. So that actually can catch fire and smolder and pop back up later, but then it brings the fire way below the surface, and that's much more damaging because it can do that with live roots of live trees. And so that in itself can kill the tree, even if the fire doesn't reach the crown. If the roots get fried, then the tree can die. And then crown fires. So this is an example of a heavily overstocked ponderosa pine stand. It looks really green and beautiful and lush, but again, it's like the 11 brothers with the mashed potatoes at the table. Somebody's going to go hungry. Somebody's eventually going to suffer. And if you get a fire in there, unfortunately, that's what it looks like. So a crown fire is completely destructive to, the trees can't survive this. It's like if a person gets burned and your skin, over 90% of your body gets burned, you won't survive that. So the forest and the trees are very similar. So how does a fire move from the ground up into the crowns of the trees? It's called ladder fuels, and that's part of what we're trying to do with Firewise, is to remove the ladder fuels that are brush or extra debris, dead trees, anything that's close to the house, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but to remove them, because they can take a healthy surface fire or a fairly healthy ground fire and move it up into the crowns, and that's when it becomes really destructive and catastrophic. So just a picture of it moving from the ground up into the crowns. Okay, so this is the ballpark fire. I was speaking with somebody before the presentation today. This is the fire that was right across the way by the gas station. And wasn't that a little scary that the fire started right by the gas station, right? So very interesting. I spoke with Dick Cook after this, who is the Ruidoso Village Forester, and he was sharing some information at a presentation, and he threw out a bunch of facts, and I thought, I gotta grab that. If it's okay, give me permission, and I'll use that and share that in Firewise. And he said, absolutely. So this area had been thinned about 20 years ago, and for whatever reason, probably money, because that's usually one of the limiting factors, is some of the slash being the debris that's created after a harvest or a thinning. Some of the slash had been left. So the trees were cut, they were thinned, but it was completely left on the ground. Some was piled, but it wasn't burned. And then other areas had some of it that was lopped and scattered, so it was thinner, but it still was on the ground. Very, very interesting to see what happens. On the slide over here to the far right, that would be the west, okay? So the official acreage of this fire was 25. It could have gone down Gavilan Canyon. It could have jumped into Ruidoso. It could have hopped right over the ridge and come here. I mean, it was very, very close. So again, the area was thinned in 2001. On the east side, which is the side that burned the hottest, slash was piled in places after the thinning of 2001 and left in other places. This area had not been treated or thinned again, so you had probably knee-deep slash in this area. You had 80 to 90% mortality of the remaining trees. Some of it was a scorch, heat. I think he said only two, they determined only 2 of the trees were actually burned. So they died from the heat of the scorch. They didn't actually catch on fire. There's a way that you can tell because the needles are not consumed. But 80 to 90% of the trees in that area were killed. So again, you have root scorch. So if the ground gets super hot and it goes way down below the surface, then even if the crowns are still nice and green, the roots are scorched and the trees will die. But on the west side where it's all green, for whatever reason, that area had 100% slash cleanup. And then they had just gone back in there and thinned it again. So they had 0% mortality. So this is just something right out our back door that shows why thinning and slash cleanup, it's incredibly effective as a hazardous fuels mitigation. So this is, I think he took this picture in September. So this was about 2 months after the fire in the part that had 0 mortality, and it's all nice and green underneath. And the logs that you see over there are what they're doing for the areas that did have some mortality. They removed that, I'm sure you saw, as they were doing some thinning and getting the standing dead trees out, and that's what that is right there. I know I'm moving kind of quick. Anybody have any questions about any of this? Okay. So this is just an example, a pictorial example of, again, how the fire can get from the ground up into the crowns of the tree. And if you don't have fuel on the ground, heavy fuels on the ground, and you thin it out, then it stays on the ground like it's supposed to. Just another visual example. So after the burn. Okay, and we all know this too intrinsically, I think, but it's kind of interesting to take a look at it scientifically, because it's not just the fire, and it's not just houses and neighborhoods. There's a whole lot more that's affected. So heavily burned forests are at risk for severe erosions because the rains and the snow do always return, maybe not in the time and the way and the amount that we want them to, but they do always return. So all of the following pictures about the erosion were taken by my boss over on the Gila National Forest over by Silver City and in the area over there after a severe burn. And then they had monsoons, and this is what it looked like. So heavy precipitation often follows, washing away the precious soil. And so even if you had a few trees that survived to throw some seed in, it would be very difficult because all the nutrients in the soil oftentimes get swashed away. So these were pictures. This was a major road in through the area, and it's a tree that got washed by a monsoon flood. And then again, debris, we've all seen that. Gavilan Canyon was closed because it was full of debris after a little microburst. And the side of the road is gone. Let's see. Okay. So becoming Firewise, to circle back to why we're here. The idea is to harden the space around our homes. So we remove combustible material right up against the home, within a short distance of the home, and on our property. So if a fire does come through, the idea is to prevent it from taking the structures, and of course taking lives as well. So how homes ignite? This is an actual picture. I think I spoke with somebody before who knew Frank Silva. Frank took this picture. So this is someone in this community who called on him for technical assistance, but they didn't want to cut their trees. So he took a picture and he was like, well, I can't help you make your house safer from wildfire because they wouldn't remove the branches and the trees are right up against the home. And so this is not a Firewise. This is not hazardous fuels mitigation. We love our trees, we really do, but this is not safe. If their fire comes through, the local fire department would just drive by and like, that house is not salvageable because if you get an ember in those trees, the house is gone as well. So, yeah. Okay, this is a couple pictures from a fire in California. So I thought it was really interesting because the photographer took one before thinning, one during the fire, and from the exact same place after the fire, and you can see the house is still standing. So because they thinned the property ahead of time and removed combustible materials before the fire came through, their house was still standing when the fire went through. Same with this. It's called a home ignition zone. The idea is, again, to clear or reduce combustible materials right up against the home. So, you know, it's not very pretty right now, but eventually it'll turn green. But the house was saved. This homeowner did not thin their property. And I don't do this to be like a scare tactic. This is just the reality of what happens when we don't. So again, this homeowner thinned their property, and this one did not. So what can we do to protect our homes and community from the risk of wildfire? So this is a picture, a local picture of a pinyon juniper stand with different piles that have been cut and stacked with the idea that these aren't going to stay here. They'll either be burned or they'll be hauled away. But they reduced the what's called the basal area, or the number of trees per acre, by more than half. So again, because we've removed a natural fire component from the forest ecology, even woodlands like pinyon juniper, we get twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as many seedlings that should be there that come up, and then they crowd one another, and then it just creates a big mess and is very dangerous fire-wise. So this is just really interesting. If you can see this, the middle part shows some really narrow tree rings, and the outer part by the bark shows really wide tree rings. So for that arrow, it says 70 years. So from the pith of the center of the tree out, that first arrow is 70 years worth of annual growth. Once they thin the forest, this tree was not cut at the first thinning. That last batch of 10 years, which is almost as long as the 70 years, shows how the tree was released. So the nutrients, the water, were then available in the soil, and the tree went nuts and put on a lot of growth. Does that make sense? So when it's suppressed, it couldn't hardly grow. It would grow a little bit, but it didn't grow vigorously. But once it was released, because the competition was removed, the tree went crazy. And eventually, it got cut anyway. So this is the exact same area before thinning. You cannot even see, 30 feet into the stand and after thinning. And the same thing here as well, before thinning and after thinning. Okay, so this is the part for you all. This is the part of what can you do as a homeowner. Yes, sir?
What's the ideal tree population there?
Okay, so that was a really good question. What's the ideal tree population per acre? And my answer is a government standard answer: it depends. So it depends on the aspect, the slope, your elevation, where you are, and what's already there. And so in an area like this is again a transition area, so this would be pinyon juniper, ponderosa pine. So it depends on the size of the trees as well. So the way we measure that is you take the diameter of the tree, and you want a representative of what's called the basal area. It's kind of hard to explain, but it translates into being number of trees per acre based on the size. So if you have a lot of little trees, or you have a few big trees, it makes a really big difference. So a lot of it is, I tell people, invite me out, let me take a look, because I can tell you this area over here is really good and healthy. The spacing's great for this particular species of trees. We have to remember that as well. Not all people are alike, not all trees are alike. So what pinyon juniper needs is different than what ponderosa pine needs, which is different than Douglas fir needs, and so on. So, yeah. Kind of answered your question, maybe? Maybe kind of, sort of. So, let me go back to that. because that's really worth discussing. So on the Firewise website, and I'll get to your question in a second, sir. On the Firewise website, you can find all of this information, okay? And it's basically, you just Google Firewise, and it'll get you to the site, and you can find out the steps that you individually and as a community, as neighborhoods and as a subdivision, and then the country club itself can do to become Firewise. But these are some really simple things. You don't have to wait for a program. You can begin to do right now. Clean out your gutters with leaves, clean dead and dying trees, thin them out, cleaning dead branches from the ground so that they're not, doesn't create a ladder fuel. So, yes, sir. So let's go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious. Assuming this happens, or do any of those calculations, what impact does that have on the existing model? Is that elk, deer, bear, whatever?
Oh, very good question. So how does it affect wildlife habitat? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, okay. So wildlife I'm not a wildlife biologist, but I do know a little bit. Part of forestry training is to make sure you know who inhabits the forest that we try to manage for. So it's just like the species are different, have different requirements. Wildlife species have different requirements as well. So elk are grazers, deer are browsers. Then you also have, bear, coyote, mountain lion, and then the smaller non-game species, if you will. So they all have different needs, and they oftentimes are competing with one another. So a healthy plot of land, oftentimes, if it's a large enough plot of land, several acres, I would encourage that landowner. You can do a lot of things at one time. You can mitigate for hazardous fuels reduction. By opening up the forest, you're also creating more forage, which is what the large ungulates like. So elk and deer, they like the large areas for grazing. But they also like cover, and they like corridors between different parts of an ecosystem. So having diversity is really important for wildlife. So it's not all or nothing, it's both and, if that makes sense. So to have areas where they can bed down, areas where they can hide and feel safe, and then passageways from one part of a habitat to the other part is all important. So again, it's very land specific. It depends on the person's land, how much land they have, if they have water, and then if it's super rocky and really steep, you might have bighorn sheep. You might not have a whole lot of deer and elk. So it very much, we let the land tell us what it can and cannot maintain. It's a great question, thank you. So anybody else? Yes, sir.
Mary, if a homeowner wants to clean up its property, I know grant money comes and goes. Yeah, thank you. Mary, if a homeowner wants to clean up and clear its property, I realize the grant money comes and goes. Is there currently grant money available for the homeowners?
Great question, and yes, there is. So each of the grants that I have been a part of administering have a 2 to 3 year cycle for the smaller ones. So what that means is we apply for the grants. The grant is awarded usually about 6 months later. A work plan is initiated, which allows the funds to be available and accessible to homeowners.
So for these people,
so yes.
if they want to access the grant money, would they contact you, or what would be their...
Yes, so there's a couple things that you can do. You don't have to wait for cost share funds to thin your property. That's the first thing to be able to say. People are doing this on their own. They're hiring their own contractors, but certainly that is a component, is to do it with cost share funds as well. So the cost share program, just real quick since you brought that up, is a cost share program. Most of the grants are not 100% reimbursed. Some are, but most of them are 50 to 70% reimbursed. The one that we have current right now is about half accounted for. So there's a little over $100,000 left in what's the word I'm looking for? Someone hasn't gotten dibs for them already, so basically someone gives an application to me and they get put at the back of the line for processing until the money runs out, and they stay on a waiting list, and then the next funds become available. Those are the first ones to have the funds available, if that makes sense. So, yes, ma'am.
Are there guidelines around cutting down live trees that we need to follow?
Yes. So some of that, her question was, are there guidelines for cutting live trees? And the answer is yes. So typically, unless you are a contractor who knows how to use a chainsaw, I would very strongly encourage people to get a professional contractor get references. I actually have a contractor list, 2 of them, one of them out of Capitan and in Otero County, and then another one I just snagged Dick Cooks from Ruidoso. And although we do check, it's still up to the landowner to make sure that they are licensed and bonded, and I would strongly recommend getting good references before you hire someone to come. So what happens in the Firewise program is it's like a bullseye target. So with the home being in the center, 0 to 5 feet away, you pretty much don't want any combustible material at all. 5 to 30 feet away, very little, and then 30 to 100 to 200 feet away. So it graduates. And again, we don't want everybody to live on a prairie. That's why we're up here. We like our trees. But the idea is to think about how we do this intelligently so we can reduce hazardous fuels, save our home in case of a wildfire, and do this so it is still aesthetically pleasing. And so there's a lot of components to this, so that was a really good question. Anybody else? So yes, sir, over here, and then we'll get back.
My understanding when I moved in, you cannot cut a live tree in Alto without permission by getting it approved from somebody.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer for that, Tom. I would presume there are some covenants because you live in a...
Yeah, it is in a
developed
covenant,
community.
so do you have to go get permission for each tree, or do you got to get a plan? How would a homeowner go about getting this done?
Well, again, if we're doing Firewise, then we would follow the Firewise, and Tom is heading that up. So again, the idea is not to clear cut the property, right? We like our trees, we want to do it well, but we also want to reduce hazardous fuels. So a couple components of that, and I'll let him address that. He may have some answers to that as well. So again, look for combustible materials. Clean out your gutters. Don't use bark chips right along your house, because you get a live ember that lands there, then you have a source of ignition right up against your home, things of that sort. Again, even green material, green vegetation, if it gets hot enough, it'll burn. So part of it is not just think about what's on the ground that's coming on a ground fire, but what gets lofted as lit embers, or what we call firebrands. So a firebrand can actually take lit material, ignited material, up to 1 mile or 2 away from the ignition source. So let's say you had, up the ski run road, there was a fire, but it got up into the crowns of the tree and you had 50 miles an hour wind. That could loft lit firebrands onto property, onto roofs. So things that normally under certain conditions would not burn, under other conditions really might. So would you like to address the...
Well, Eric has informed me that you do not have to get a permit to cut a tree. Now there is, I think there's reference to clear cutting, but I would suggest come to the Architectural Control Commission meeting, get on the agenda, and they will be able to, it's kind of like the covenants and deed restrictions on the satellite dishes on the roof. The club just didn't enforce them. And so there is verbiage to it. I think probably Ron, you probably have more knowledge about that than anybody in this room, but is that accurate? Got a nod, yes or no?
The 93 covenants,
Which I understand are now the covenants of that the club will be operating under for a period. Actually has a language in it that says any tree over 6 inches in diameter, you need to get a permit. As far as the enforcement of that, the ACC really has not paid too much attention to that. At the time that language was put into the covenants, there weren't too many trees. So you can certainly, as Tom suggested, come to the ACC meeting. Getting a permit to cut trees on your property would be an easy thing to obtain if we even feel it's necessary. But technically the language is in the 93 covenants, and but if you're thinning your property, I think the positive benefits of that overweigh the language, which might be very, very old. So, Tom, does that help?
Yeah, so I would just encourage everybody, ask a lot of questions. So let's say you decide you want to enter into a cost share agreement. So you have an application process, and then again, it goes to the back of the line as the funds and time become available, they get processed. But in that meantime, you can certainly talk to the architectural board and find out some information and talk to contractors. So you don't have to begin that part if that might take a little time to process as well. So yeah, again, being from the government, we get to wait in line, and there's a lot of patience that we appreciate as we're processing this. But let's say you were to go ahead with a thinning. The trees can be designated so that you can invite the board in and say, these are the ones I want to take out as well. So, you know, a lot of that is just good communication and understanding and good planning. So, stop.
So a couple of observations on what you're talking about there. I know that most of these licensed guys that do that for a living, they know exactly what the model is that the Forest Service has. And and in the Forest Service, you can request, sometimes you gotta be very patient for the person to come out. You can request that they come mark your trees. And what they typically do is take a can of paint and spray the trees they want you to leave, and then you just instruct whoever's gonna thin it to thin everything but the trees with the mark on them.
Right.
And so you don't really have to guess. If you wanna do it completely to their standard, a lot of people wanna leave various things and, you know, modify that. But if you do it exactly to their standard, the bulk of these guys know how to do that.
And I would agree, my experience has been as well, the contractors know their business because they're almost all referrals. So if they don't do a good job, then they don't get good referrals and they don't make money and they go out of business. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to mark the trees. One of the things that's real important to understand, however, is they're grant driven. So we have the landowner's needs and desires, the community zoning, and what the community says can and cannot happen there. But then you also have what the grant says. So this is hazardous fuels, all of them that are current right now are hazardous fuel reduction grants. So they're not aesthetically to, you know, lot branches so you can see Sierra Blanca a little better. They're not to clean up dead and down material on the ground from the Little Bear fire. They are to thin existing overstocked wooded stands, and the language is such that we can't compromise on that. So it really depends. That's why I really encourage people, call me and I'll come out and see, because I know what the grants say, and that way I can make sure it meets what your needs are as well. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mary, we have a general problem around the community too. Lots of absentee landlords, lots of unbuilt lots with stuff growing like crazy. Is there anything we can do?
Well, that's a great question, Eric. We talked over by coffee a little while ago, and I said that one of my favorite sayings is you can't lead a horse to water and make him drink, but you can make them thirsty. And one way to make them thirsty is to encourage people. I like the carrot more than the stick, personally, because you know, if you don't have somebody driving the stick, you know, the horse will stop or the mule will stop. All it takes is a little carrot, a sweet treat out in front. So, and what that means is that community as a whole, if there's a very positive, very encouraging, here's who we are and here's what we're doing and here's why. So you all have an understanding of this is a very proactive way to get your forests healthy and you keep your community healthy. That's a really positive little carrot to dangle out in front of people. We want you on our team. We want you to be a part of this. You know, this is who we are as a community, and to be here, you know, again, a very proactive, positive, encouraging. I think that's a really good place to start. So, you know, as far as contacting absentee landowners, that's a constant challenge for everyone who is here. It is in the village of Ruidoso. It is out even in some of the areas where it's larger chunks of land with ranch owners who have way overstocked forests and they really need some thinning. But again, it's need driven. And so we're together today because you have a need, and so you're trying to get educated. And so just really encourage people, you need to find out about this, right? Smile, nod your head. Yeah, this is a really great thing. Yeah, you should call Mary, she'll help you, you know, kind of thing. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
Does the golf course have a plan?
So say again, I'm sorry?
Does the golf course have a plan for their land?
I don't know that I have an answer to that.
Glad you're here, Tom.
Yeah. I would presume because it's within the Firewise community that is trying to be established, that's a component of that as well. It might not, a lot of the details were right at the beginning stages of this, have probably not been all ironed out, but that's a really good question to ask.
Check. All right. Other mics is in service. The club is going to lead by example. You know, the board of directors has the foresight to know that this stuff all has a cost. You know, the board has decided to restrict money or have money set aside to get this program started. And so, yeah, the club will get our property. Now, our property is very minimal when you really look at it. You know, the fairways don't have any trees on it, and you know where the out-of-bounds stakes are. And so, you know, we don't have a lot of land, but we're going to get our land in order and, you know, lead by example and communicate with you all. I mean, if you want to get a grant, God, that's great, you know, but if not, you know, we're going to have, there's components of our current covenants and deed restrictions that allow us some leeway to go to property owners and go through a path and a plan where, you know, if there isn't any response, we can go ahead and move in and clear, and then apply that to club members' account. But that's not to become Firewise certified. That's just to get the initial cleaning, to get the debris, the grass down, get the debris off the ground. And we've already started that process. Now, there's been some developments recently that, you know, we have to consider that, you know, how we move forward with that. But anyway, there is a commitment from the club to get, you know, to be part of this process and lead by example.
Question being on the utility easements, as far as the water and sewer and so forth, a lot of those easements are covered with piles of brush. Whose responsibility is that?
Well, I can't say for sure, but my guess would be whoever owns the land underneath the piles. So if that is the electric company, they actually have programs for clearing electric lines above ground lines, and they do that actively. There's just a whole lot, miles and miles and miles of lines to clear.
If you have an easement that needs cleaning, it's your responsibility. For that property, the property owner's responsibility. And there are easements on your property that have debris, that is the property owner's. According to our former ACC executive, Eric here, he informed me that it's not the utility company or whatever, it's your responsibility as the property owner.
Well, and we're just beginning as a Firewise community here in Alto Country Club. I don't live here, but you all are beginning. But one thing that's really, really important to keep in mind is there's a lot to do, and we're right at the initial stages, but it's very exciting to be sort of, you know, the first on the bandwagon, to be a part of this, to be leadership in this. And so, you know, again, people follow by example. And so if you're excited, you're very proactive, and you're really encouraging other people in the community who maybe just don't really understand, you know, that's a really powerful tool. It's kind of a positive peer pressure, not a negative one, but a very positive one. The other thing I'd like to really just let you know is we have a nonprofit agency that we partner with that sort of is the go-between federal funding, state allocation, and then landowner recipients for the cost share funds. And that is South Central Mountain RC&D out of Ruidoso. And they purchased a few years ago this really cool apparatus called an air curtain incinerator, which for very small projects like 10 acres or less can actually burn and consume in a very safe capacity slash that's created by thinning. And so there are tools and other things out there besides the bill is just on you, cost share being one, and then the air curtain incinerator being another. And again, it takes a lot of education, a lot of coordination, a lot of planning, but it also takes that spark plug of a person to say, yes, we want to do this. It's a good thing. Let's move forward. So, yes, ma'am.
I mentioned to you earlier, I did participate in the cost sharing program.
Go ahead, sorry.
Okay.
We did participate in the cost sharing program, and it was really an excellent, easy process. We filled out the application. Your predecessor, Frank Silva, came by. He identified the trees. There were one or two that we really wanted to keep, and he worked around that by taking out some other trees that that he had originally planned to keep. We've got about 5 feet from the house that is gravel, just a little pea gravel all the way around. And anyone who's driven by the house seemed to think it looks good. So it wasn't like a slash, And we got the contractor to cut down the trees. They took them to our, garbage disposal, so there was no cost to dispose of the downed trees and slash. And we got a check from your organization, and I think we were 50% reimbursed at the time. But it went very, very smoothly, and we were very happy with the results.
Good. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Deidre just reminds me, we had gotten a letter from our USAA insurance company saying if we hadn't trimmed the trees, they would drop us our insurance. And we got a statement from Frank saying that our property was Firewise protected, and we were able to keep our insurance.
And I'm not an insurance agent, I'm not a real estate agent, I'm a forester. So a lot of the questions that you have are more specific to some of the other parts of this. But that is a really, really good point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, is insurance. Right, looks very favorably at proactive management to mitigate hazardous fuels. I mean, how many millions, billions of dollars just in the Dixie Fire was paid to landowners who lost property, right? And so insurance companies are struggling, and so they want to make sure they have a good investment, if you will. And so I appreciate that very much. Thank you for sharing. So any other questions? Okay, so let me see if I can wrap this up. And so here's the part we're going to talk about what's called the home ignition zone. So if it's attached to the house or very close to the house, we kind of consider it part of the home ignition zone or part of the property, the house. Okay? So in other words, if you have a wooden deck, it's not part of the structure of the home, but that's where your Firewise begins, on the outside of the deck. So we actually consider the deck as part of the structure of the home. If you have a favorite tree, your grandma planted it when she was 3 years old with her grandfather or whatever, and it's right next to the tree, right next to the house, we wouldn't really recommend that for a lot of reasons. However, if you just can't part with that, then that is considered part of the home, and the home ignition zone actually is away from that, if that makes sense. So something that's included in part of that area, and from there 5 feet out, non-combustible, whether it's a wooden deck or it's a tree or shrubs, if that makes sense. Okay? Okay, so a couple other things to just be thinking about. This isn't construction. I think everyone probably has a home who is here, but the materials which we make our homes out of, or what we remodel out of. I used to live in Flagstaff, and it was a really common, popular thing back then for people to have shake shingle roofs. That makes me shiver from head to toe, because they're shake shingles made of wood. You get a lit ember on that and the whole house is gone. Even if the house is made of brick, it's gone. And so, metal roofs preferred. Screening is really important as well. So if you have a crawl space or something underneath, again, think lofted, lit on fire embers. Where could they land where there's leaves or debris that could start a fire? Okay. Siding and all of those things to be considered. Double paned or tempered glass, protective overhangs. Again, anything that can accumulate litter or debris that could ignite, or the material itself could ignite. So this is a good picture. Give you an idea of the home ignition zone. So you have the home. The garage would also count as a part of that. So it can be a standalone building, but you want it to be anything that you've invested a lot of money in that you want to save. Remove all combustible material between 0 and 5 feet. Reduce combustible material 5 to 30 feet, and then 30 to 100 feet. You want less trees, less as much as you can clear off the ground. Again, if a fire started on the ground, it wouldn't get up into the crowns and it wouldn't run. So this is just sort of a pictorial example of that bullseye I was talking about before. Okay, okay, so Firewise communities. Again, this is a nationwide program, and so this has been going on for several decades now. I think this program began in the 90s. right after the Yellowstone fire of '88, communities began to realize, like Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that they were also at risk from these mega fires. And so people started to gather together and do really good things to make their communities themselves much safer against hazardous wildfires. Okay, so this is some of the requirements to become a Firewise community. And just a little snapshot, because it's getting kind of late, is you have to have a specialist complete a community assessment. And that's what the team, I believe, on the board is doing. And I'm here sort of as a forester specialist to assist as well. And then they register if you have enough community participants, and then away you go. But you also have to maintain that, and then show improvement every year, and show management every year. Okay, so this is the Firewise website. Again, real simply, you could just Google Firewise Communities or Firewise USA. It'll take you right to the website, and there's so much information. It's really, really good. So, and again, here's my information. And so I'd just like to ask if there's any final questions before we finish. You guys are wonderful. So, because we also, New Mexico Forestry Division in Capitan also has the Smoky Bear Museum, I would like to encourage you. I brought some really fun things for you to see, some of them for you to take if you have kids or grandkids or great-grandkids or neighbor kids or anything. And some of us, there's a big kid in all of us too. So if you would like to have any of the materials, including Living with Fire, which has the materials on Firewise, there's some publications up here. So if there aren't any further questions, I want to thank you for your time and attention. You guys have been wonderful. And my card is up here. If you have any needs that you think I might be able to help you with, give me a call, send me an email, and I'd be happy to be at your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. And guys, I think we're done, and we appreciate y'all coming. Thank you.
To get on the list, what you do is to send because this is each one would still have to be because that's our process. That if you set that as a community site or talk to there's a specific community.
She's over there, so we can go out.
I saw him in the logo. I How are you? I got my temporary. So they like around all my season. Yeah, I stuck this thing in 3 times. Work. They knocked you out? They're fun, you know, it's like sure it's nice to go jump in. Well, the process. I saw him, yep, because I'm driving. She does. Temporary. Oh, I don't know what it's made out of. I guess it's plastic. Yeah, it looks like it just breaks. So I know what you're doing right here. Yes, because I'm getting a new car in the temporary. It feels like, you know, like when you got the film on your ink or something. Yes, and you can. You ever watch that Chase like that? Well, I don't know about that. But I mean, it's kind of the same. Because mine will clear all the cross. It's all front. It's just like a painter. Yeah. I know exactly what you're saying. By the time you get it's worth it. You just have to get pictures. I was happy before. I couldn't see. Now you're even happier. But I will be there tomorrow if y'all right. Well, that's what take care of tires or whatever, just that way you know when you come get in the road, you'll know. I don't know what yours was waiting. Yeah, the one is that my age or my hair? It was perfect. And he just kept, when I looked at it, he just kept talking and talking. And I